Welcome back to another episode, eReads podcast listeners. I am your host, Liz, and this is my podcast where I talk about books, authorship, and all the different parts of the creative process. Today, we are talking about one of my favorite topics, really, which is world building. Sarena helps us with some tips and tricks to help us create realistic environments that will immerse our readers in our story. So I can't wait for you to learn more about her and her books. So let's just jump right into the episode. Welcome, Sarena. I am so excited to pick your brain about so many things. So how are you today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for asking. And to welcome you to the show, I like to start with what I call like a bookish question, which is just something kind of book related. And the question that I thought of for you is, okay. So kind of with your background and thinking about kind of like crime dramas and stuff like that. And I was also watching a TV show where a character was having their last meal. So my question for you is, what would your character's last meal be? Because you do a little fiction and nonfiction, correct?
Yeah. I'm mostly focused on fiction now. Funny, I know what my last meal would be. What would my character's last meal be? I would say, it's 100 years in the future. They have very different access to food. And as book one ends, she is very limited to some very processed foods. So I think she'd be really happy to have anything fresh from a garden or
Oh,
not
nice.
reconstituted, or I think it would be like a wide variety of things she'd enjoy as long as they weren't reconstituted.
That's a good point. And so can you please tell us, well, before you tell us more about, your novel, how did writing get started for you? What was this always a dream for you?
It actually wasn't. Most of my career path has taken me by surprise. I started my career as a lawyer, which completely took me by surprise. My father had been telling me I'd be a lawyer from the time I was about 2, and maybe just because I was argumentative, which made it self-fulfilling prophecy, I was like, no, I won't. Um, but yeah, I ended up practicing law, and I started my career as a prosecutor in the Bronx, and I was working mostly in crimes against children. So I would say it was two things that started me writing. The first is I came to realize that I was already a storyteller. So when you boil uh, cases down, down to their essence, especially criminal cases, you're a storyteller. You're trying
Hmm.
to convey to a jury what happened in a way that, they can absorb and understand, and, putting the pieces together. So you're kind of, a detective too. So from the minute you get a case, you're already in your head kind of forming what your argument to the jury is going to be, which is really storytelling.
Right.
And then I started writing poetry really as catharsis because of the types of cases I was dealing with. I started writing as a coping mechanism.
Hmm.
And that evolved into a book about my work at the DA's office. And from there, I tried writing some crime fiction, which would have seemed like the natural progression, but I found I just didn't really enjoy it. Like I
Yeah.
knew it, I understood it, but it's not really what I read. It's not really what I enjoyed writing. And what I love is science fiction. So that led me, once you have that writing bug, it's
Right.
hard to shake, and that led me to writing science fiction.
Oh, that is really cool. And so like so many questions all at one time. So I'll go to this question, then I'll back up to like your nonfiction. How was it writing fiction as compared to nonfiction? Right? Like, is there one that you prefer more?
I definitely prefer fiction, but it's a lot harder. Nonfiction, you know what the story is already, and
Right.
the work is in the craft, and in the editing, and how do I tell, it's still a story, and you want to
Hmm.
tell it in a compelling way, but you don't have to invent it. And particularly when I was writing my first book, Bronx DA, I had a lot of resources I could refer back to. So when
Hmm.
you're writing memoir, a lot of it comes from your memory, but I had the advantage of court transcripts and things like that to kind of check what I remembered, and I could actually look at what I had said. Fiction, you have to invent all that and do the editing and make it compelling. So I like it more, but it's harder to write and it's harder to sell.
Absolutely. Um, and in we were going to talk about world building, and it got me thinking, because I think a lot of times we talk about world building in terms of fiction, but in nonfiction there is an element of world building, right? You have to take this ordinary and make it appealing and make it interesting, and like, how do you do that, right? Like, how do you go about creating worlds that people want to read?
I think for Bronx DA, it was easy in a way because people are really captivated by true crime, and
Right.
I think the Bronx is a place that's really interesting to people. It's really a character in the book, and the people are interesting and diverse in every way. Background, economics,
Mhm.
racially, ethnically. Um, so it's a fascinating place to write about and to read about. So that was easy. At least I didn't have a backdrop that was uninteresting to people that I had to make interesting. And my science fiction book, REINCEPTION, is set in New York City, 100 years in the future. And I think anytime you're, imagining a future world, it's interesting to people. But the way I developed that world, and of course, I think New York is fascinating, but I'm a
It
typical New
is.
Yorker. But I built that world the way I think all civilizations are built. I built it on the foundation of what's already there. So I imagine, what will New York be like 100 years in the future? What will the place be like? What will the people be like? How will New York be coping with things like climate change?
Mm.
And how will we deal with how we're growing our food and things like that? And so I crafted the world around that, using New York as we know it today as a foundation, and saying, okay, so for example, the subways are probably going to be flooded.
Mm.
How are people going to deal with that? What are they going to do with that infrastructure? How are we going to be trying to hold back the water and protect the city from further erosion? So it was really fun and interesting to kind of envision and looking at real science and saying, okay, where are we headed and how are we going to cope with that? And how will a city like New York try to kind of persevere?
Mm. I like that kind of, again, sometimes we talk about what ifs questions in writing, but I like that framing it with world building. Like, okay, well, what if this gets worse, or what if this changes, and what if this, and letting your mind kind of wander. And I think that's really interesting, when you are creating these worlds and seeing where that leads you.
Yeah, and it was fun to kind of combine what I know. So I set the book on the Upper West Side, and the main character is a college student, and that's where I went to college. So I
Oh,
thought about
cool.
what was my experience like, and what will her experience be like, and what will be the same, and what will be different.
Mm.
My university was there long before I was, and I hope it'll be there, long after I'm gone. But certainly, a lot of things won't look the same, but maybe some things will. So it was fun to kind of picture her where I was and to think
Yeah.
about where she would be.
Oh, that is really cool. And so tell us a little bit more about, I might get the pronunciation wrong, so please help me out. Is it reception?
Reinception.
Reinception.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
please
So
tell us more about this story and your character.
Like I said, it's set 100 years in the future in New York City. The main character is a college student. And the backdrop of this is that we have the technology to modify human behavior. And it was developed by a man who'd lost his child to addiction. And
Mm.
he wanted to spare other people the pain that he had suffered. But of course, it starts being used for all kinds of other things. So people use it for some things that are pretty benign, like weight loss, exercise, concentrating better in school. But on the flip side of that, parents are allowed to use it on their children. And there's a lot of controversy and debate around that, about privacy and autonomy. And maybe they're using it for their kids to help them have better eating habits or study better, but they're also using it to limit their sexual desires, to stop them from drinking alcohol, to change their opinions and beliefs. So for some really controversial purposes, and then the government's using it on prisoners, and they're using it on the lower. I have a caste system. They're using it on the lower caste, and the main character is kind of passively anti-reinception. She's one of the few people left who has not been modified. And she's
Wow.
at the age for the first time where she can decide for herself whether she wants to be modified. And she's grappling with that decision when her boyfriend is forcibly reprogrammed by his parents. And she
Wow.
ends up teaming up with a supposed terrorist to try to expose the truth about reinception. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Oh, that is interesting because it's interesting because you can kind of see some of this in real life with, government trying to shape and all of this, and then to think about what does that look like in the future. So like there's that hook of like, oh my gosh, like we are living this, but like what does this look like? And so that is really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the technology I extrapolated this from is a current technology that's actually being used to treat depression really effectively. So
Hmm.
I'm certainly not criticizing the technology I based it on, but saying like, if we could really use this to change behaviors, how would we use it? How would we abuse it? And thinking a lot about what we already deal with, and especially young people deal with in terms of their privacy and their autonomy. What's going to happen in the future when technology can control that even more.
Absolutely. That is a really cool and interesting world. Um, Question, or like your opinion, like, do you think when creating world building, thinking about its connection to where we currently are in life? So, like, for instance, like your book, again, it plays with some of these themes that we're seeing now, but in the future. Do you think that helps to make it real? Like when we can kind of have something to compare it to?
Definitely. I talk a lot and teach a lot about different kinds of world building. So building a fantasy world
Mm-hmm.
versus building, like you were asking about before, building a world in nonfiction,
Mm-hmm.
which you're still doing in a way, or building a speculative futures world. They're all very different things. So a fantasy world you can completely imagine, or if it's a space story, like
Mm-hmm.
what does this other planet look like? But I think definitely if you do your job well in speculative futures, people can really imagine it. They
Mm-hmm.
can imagine that this is what the world is going to look like in the future. And hopefully I've done that well. I've been told that people could, really see it and they find it to be a credible possibility.
Mm. I love that because it's almost like with character driven stories, right? Like being able to see and experience and like live that experience is always nice. Sometimes like I hate with a book, or like it's hard to be invested in a book when you just can't see yourself in that world, even when it's like the most fantastical of things, right? You want to feel like you're there. So like I appreciate like the way it's kind of grounded in reality so you could be really immersed.
Yeah, and I think also seeing how a person you can relate to, and really, I do like to write relatable characters and real characters. So this is a human being with her, her flaws and her
Mhm.
strengths and her weaknesses. And I said it in college because I think that that's such a pivotal time in our lives to kind of explore our autonomy and test what we are really capable of. And she kind of starts her journey feeling like she's just one person and she doesn't really have the ability to affect change. But it's forced upon her in a way. And then she starts to realize what her power is, and she's navigating this world, and she has to start to also navigate things in that world that are unfamiliar to her. So when she teams up with this terrorist, the society is divided into two castes, but New York is also kind of layered into two layers, with the upper class living like literally above and the lower caste living literally below, and using the flooded subway tunnels to get around unnoticed and things like that. And she suddenly has to learn how to navigate this technology free world with people who don't have the resources that she has, and starting to like not only appreciate the difference in her life from theirs, but also appreciate that she's capable of a lot more than she thinks she's capable of.
Very cool. Very cool. And then switching gears a little bit, you got to do something really cool, or something really cool happened is, one of your stories got picked up for a TV pilot. Can you share what that experience was like?
Yeah, it was a lot of it was luck, to be honest, and relationships. So one thing I always tell people is don't burn your bridges. Be stay connected with people. Be generous for the sake of being generous, not to get something back. But I believe in
Mhm.
karma too. um, so Bronx DA was somebody I went to law school with actually reached out to me. He had a friend who was a TV writer who was looking for a project, and she was really into writing things about crime. And so he put us together, and she fundamentally wrote the pilot, and I consulted on it. So she optioned the book, and I went out with her out to LA and went to all the pitches and things like that. And so the book got picked up as a pilot. Unfortunately, it didn't get picked up as a show. That year CBS had one slot, and it went to JJ Abrams, which was hard to that was hard to fault them for. But the TV writer I worked with has gone on to have great success. So I think if we'd been doing it now, maybe things would have gone differently, because she's had a lot of really successful shows since then. But it was really exciting. A lot of those things are timing. But it was a very cool experience. And I think for a writer, when you reach that place, you start to think about, do I want to shift gears and start trying to write for TV or movies, or do I want to stay true to
Mhm.
my core, writing books, and let the professionals I let the professionals handle it.
But that's interesting, an interesting point of view, right? I didn't even kind of consider like um thinking about structuring your stories so that it is like appealing, or it could be like fit for that kind of flow. So that's interesting as well.
Yeah, I definitely, I think assimilation would translate very well to media as well. I like writing things that are cinematic, and my publisher specifically looks for works that they feel would translate well to other kinds of media. And even with Bronx DA, the concept was to fictionalize it, so it was based on me and my experience, but it was not me. And the cases were my cases, but a lot more exciting. Like things happen that fortunately didn't happen to me, like bombings, and um, so it was definitely like being made for TV. But yeah, it was. I mean, it was a really fun, interesting experience. Whether I would try to write, a screenplay or a TV script at some point, I don't know. Right now, I'm just enjoying writing books. But I would still love to see REINCEPTION on the screen. I just think at this point, at least,
I
I
would
depend
too,
on
because
someone
that
else to
sounds
do
really
it.
interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So please share with us, how can we connect with you? How can we find your works? Where should people go?
Yeah, so I'm pretty easy to find. I'm the only Sarena Straus out there, as far as I know. People usually spell my name wrong, but you'll still find me. I'm at Sarena Straus on Twitter, Instagram. My website is serenastraus.com. Um, those are the main places I'm at. I dabble in TikTok, but I mostly let the pros handle that. I lurk.
Lovely. And listen, if y'all need the spelling or anything like that, please check out the episode show notes. It will all be there. Sarena, you have such an interesting, like, again, career, from being a lawyer to dabbling in writing and almost getting it on the airways. And so it's just a really interesting career. Um, and this book, Reinception, seems very interesting. Any words for folks if they're just like, how do I make my story interesting, right? Like, what are like your tips or tricks that you would give to someone?
Um, the thing I'm starting to also screen books and look at what other people write, and I read a lot of arcs. I think the number one thing, especially when you're starting out, and if you're like me, if you didn't study this in school and have professional training, is work with a pro.
Mm.
It's definitely worth the investment to work with an editor and have them help you with things like plotting and pacing and language. It really shows when somebody sends something out that no one else has ever seen, even if it's a seasoned writer. So get feedback. And, the other thing is feedback from friends is a wonderful thing, and they're generous with their time, but usually your friends will just tell you that they love it. So you have to be open to constructive criticism and really seek it out, because the book can't be the best that it can be if you're not getting input from other people. And I think, you don't want to burn your bridges with agents or publishers, or, if you're self-publishing, with your audience by putting something out there that's not ready to be out there. So yeah, just be open to feedback, seek a professional to edit your book. If you don't have that background, and don't expect your first book to get picked up. Most people's don't, and that's okay. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of hard work. You learn a lot along the way. I really started as a pantster, and I'm not a heavy plotter, but I definitely plot now. It saves you a lot of work on the end. There's a lot of material out there that will give you guidelines around, story structure and how to have rising and falling action and all that. So it's good to read those things, and you don't have to follow them to the T, but to use those. They're there for a reason, and they're good to use as guidelines. So,
oh my God,
sorry, that was a long answer.
No, but it was all good, right? I like all those tidbits, right? I think feedback and critique is so important. I think it also gets you comfortable with sharing your work, right? Like that can be like a really vulnerable and scary process. So like definitely getting feedback, and to your point, it really does help it be stronger, because like things make sense in your head, and then when someone else, they're like, well, this isn't really clear, and it makes it stronger. Having that mentorship with a professional is very important. Just all the tips you mentioned they're really helpful, and just kind of like tightening up your work. So thank you for that.
Yeah, sure. My pleasure.
Sarena, you have been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for taking the time. Any last words before I ask you my last question?
I don't think so. It's been a joy talking to you. Thank you so much for having me on. I have a couple other books that are going to be coming out, so I
Please
hope I
tell
can
us
come back
about
and
those
talk
if
to
you
you again.
can.
Yeah, so REINCEPTION's part of a trilogy. So I'm working on book 2 now. It's the outline's complete, and I'm starting to write it. And then I also had a young adult alien invasion trilogy
Ooh.
picked up, and book 1 of that is done and in edits. So I don't have a release date for that yet, but I hope it'll be soon. And that's a really fun one, because like when we talk about what you know and where you set things in world building, I live in the Hudson Valley, which, in case you or your audience didn't know, is the alien invasion capital of the world. So I have set my story in the Hudson Valley, and there's all kinds of fun articles out there and material about alien abductions. There's even a huge festival not too far from here about abductions. So that was really fun to write too, and it was fun to have sources to cite in a book like that. So I think it'll be a fun read and good world building.
Oh, that does sound very fun. I cannot wait to check all of that out. Again, Sarena, thank you so much. Listeners, please check out her information and follow.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.